Hello, people, ahem, well, creatures in general, don't like to exert themselves, and they especially don't like to think. As Professor Savliev teaches us, the overwhelming majority of human life is aimed at minimizing the brain's energy expenditure. And for this very significant reason, even despite the obvious and undeniable signs of radical, profound changes happening throughout the entire world, people still try to pretend that absolutely nothing will fundamentally change because they deeply hope that the old, familiar ways will indeed remain. It seems to me that by now it's just plain naive to think that way. And it's time to grow up in the sense of taking responsibility for adapting to the changes that are happening. Well, let's take a look at the events that have happened literally in the last 2 or 3 days. First of all, there's the adoption of Trump's crypto laws. These laws are very specific. Of course, I'm not going to analyze them here, but I want to draw attention to just one fundamentally important point. They create a digital product with 100% backing. I want to draw your attention to the fact that banks use fractional reserve banking. This means that if a crisis occurs, the reserves backing these digital assets are preserved, whereas the money held by banks may not be. I'm not at all saying that everything will be lost. But for those who are not, so to speak, in the inner circle of the architects of these events, the likelihood of losing both money and other assets is extremely high. Today, the risk is certainly not 90%, but even if it's 15, that's already, well, for any business person, this is extremely unpleasant. I can assure you that in no bank, in no investment company, the risk assessment department does not take these risks into account. Although, perhaps, today they are among the most important, simply because it's not supposed to. But this problem arises. Moving on, I want to draw your attention to the events in the South Caucasus. We see a sharp increase in confrontation and tension on the border between Azerbaijan and Iran. We see absolutely anti-Russian statements from the president of Azerbaijan. We see how the first deputy head of TAS is groveling before him. As for who he actually works for, that's a separate topic, which I won't discuss right now. That's not my area. I'm not a political analyst. And finally, we see that in Israel, the pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu is growing very strongly, and how is he already defending himself? By citing his poor health and military actions. From this, it immediately follows that there will be military actions. Let me remind you that Azerbaijan actually has only 2 major power plants. To take them out, just 2 Iranian missiles would be enough. In other words, this means that Iran is writing them off. And as for what motivates, well, its president, that's a separate topic. And what motivates the military leaders of that country? Right now, I don't want to describe specific scenarios. I'm describing more of the general picture. Now, let's shift a bit to another place. We see that in Kiev, the leader, well, basically, the head of what has become a terrorist regime, Zelensky, is limiting the capabilities of the pro-American organization that's fighting corruption. What does this mean? It means he understands that he won't be getting support from the United States of America. As for the United States of America, they're quite reasonably saying, let Europe buy from us, and then, well, they can do whatever they want with it. Let's note that Europe doesn't have any money, with one exception: if the United States itself, through the Federal Reserve, gives that money to the European Union. If this happens, that is, if this money is either promised or has already been transferred, then nothing but a sharp conflict within the United States of America can result. By the way, I'd like to gently remind you that there's a significant theory that these specific crypto laws were only passed because they were directly traded for the complete removal of the so-called Epstein lists from the public eye. Break time equals 0.5s/. Apparently, a large number of various senators and congressmen were on those lists. But here, in fact, a small nuance arises. It's one thing to refuse to publish the Epstein lists and, accordingly, all the video clips that might be there, tens of thousands of them. And it's a completely different matter to publish specific video clips about a particular person. That's why I think that certain elements of all this will still come to light. Well, and there are some curious stories happening in our country because, if you pay close attention to which influence groups the people arrested in recent days belong to, it gives you something to think about. Again, I'm not a political scientist, so I won't get into that topic. If anyone's interested, read Professor Evstafiev. Maybe he'll say something about it, or maybe he already has. Getting back to the point that was kind of touched on at the very beginning of my commentary. The combination of all these factors makes it absolutely impossible for this knot of tension to just dissolve. It's impossible. In other words, either war, which now we understand means in the Middle East, or a financial collapse, or most likely both at the same time, are bound to happen. The only question is whether it will happen in August, September, or October. From a strategic point of view, that doesn't really matter at all. And now I'll say this. On the 30th, I mean next Wednesday, I'll be holding a webinar dedicated to how, theoretically, one can respond to all of this and what needs to be done. Of course, these will be general recommendations, since I'll have many diverse participants, including private individuals, aspiring entrepreneurs, and established business leaders from various sectors. But I want to say that, well, some kind of change, or rather, a shift in attitude towards life, should happen for people in the near future if they want to get through this crisis with minimal losses. Most likely, it won't be possible to get through without any losses at all. And, in general, in conclusion, I want to say the following. There are moments in life when you need to pull yourself together, start making decisions, and, accordingly, build a new course of action. It's no longer possible to stick to the old comfortable patterns that, for many, may have worked for decades. That's the overall level of tension. I'd also like to point out that I haven't even mentioned Putin's visit to Beijing at the end of August, nor, accordingly, Trump's ultimatum, which is clearly tied to the outcome of that visit, nor many, many other things. So, this whole picture definitely needs, well, some kind of assessment from the participants. But at the same time, I perfectly understand that it's practically impossible to do this. I mean, for me, I need to reflect, think, draw diagrams on paper, and so on. And that's considering I've been thinking about these topics for over 40 years. That's how it is. And if I recall my youth, even back in school during political information sessions, I used to ask myself, why is it this way and not another? So there you have it. It's the same kind of situation today. We need to understand that we're facing a certain wave, or if you like, a storm or something like that. Just look at pictures of an approaching storm or a flood. You know, there are videos online now where you can see a time lapse of how a flood happens, how that wave comes in. That's pretty much the same thing here. A wave is coming at us. And the feeling that you can avoid it, that you can hide or something else, that's a naive feeling. That's why I urge everyone to prepare as much as possible. And, of course, come to the webinar on the 30th. We'll be discussing what can actually be done. And as for the details, obviously, those need to be discussed individually. Thank you for your attention.